Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN Global. We're here with episode 9, season 11 of the Social Change Career Podcast. We're here today with my friend, Dr. Makram Ouaiss, who is based in Beirut, Lebanon. And we're going to be talking about careers at the intersection of peace, policy, and impact. For people who have not joined us before, usually this goes about 1 hour, and we love to hear from people around the world who are joining us. So please let us know, particularly on LinkedIn in the chat section, where you're watching from, a sentence or two about your background, and also your questions and comments, because we want to make this as interactive as possible. We might have it ready by this Friday. If not this Friday, then the following Friday, this will be up as one of over 120 episodes of the Social Change Career Podcast. So featuring brilliant innovators like Makram from around the world. So 3 quick requests before we jump in is please follow Makram on LinkedIn, follow the Center for, this think tank, check out PCDN. And if you like this episode, please consider rating and sharing and check out the other ones. That's the quick requests. So I will share Makram's bio. And then again, please let us know throughout the whole episode your questions, comments, and where you're watching from. So Makram is the executive director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, which is one of the leading think tanks in the country and in the region, which works on governance, sustainable economic development, the promotion of inclusive and effective social policies, and the environment. Before joining LCPS, he was a professor of political science and international affairs with a specialization in conflict analysis and resolution at the Lebanese American University for nearly 15 years. He is the author of many articles and studies on the topics of civil peace, elections, and democratization. He served as a senior advisor for elections to the Minister of the Interior and worked for or consulted for many international organizations such as UNDP, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, International IDEA, IFIS, and the Carter Center. He is a member of and has served on the board of several civil society organizations working on peace, dialogue, democracy strengthening, and elections. He holds a PhD from the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, the Carter School at George Mason University, and a master's degree in international affairs and economics from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. So thank you so much for joining us, Makram. And again, for anyone watching, please share where you're joining us from, your questions and your comments. So Makram, thank you so much. And can you share a little bit, and just in full transparency, Makram and I have known each other, I think, for 20 years. I lose track of time, or maybe more than 20 years. So we were kind of PhD compatriots at George Mason. And so Makram, can you share a little bit about kind of how you've tied together the focus of your career, since you've worked in policy, academia, research, like what has been some of the central themes of your work?
Well, thank you very much, Craig. It's a real pleasure to be with you here. Obviously, we're the power has just cut off here, and so part of our daily life. But anyway, just wanted to say that it's a pleasure to be with you and with your followers here on this show, and just would like to greet everyone who is watching and to thank you all for being with us. I'd like to perhaps say, to start with, that I grew up in a country at war. Unfortunately, that was the case, and it really shaped the way that I ultimately ended up pursuing my professional development and career, starting with an interest in politics as a means of solving conflicts, but also specializing later on in economics, which is obviously one of the underpinnings of many conflicts in many countries, and then later in specializing in conflict resolution, as you kindly mentioned earlier. So that has been really the main trajectory of my path, career path, academic path, I would say, and where I work today is sort of another step in that direction.
And when you think back to a younger age, and for people who don't know, you might share a little bit about the history of Lebanon, because I've been to Jordan. I've never made it to Lebanon yet, but it's a beautiful, fantastic country with a very diverse population, but also has had a troubled history. But if you think back to your younger age, what did you envision yourself doing professionally? If you think back to teenage version of yourself, were you thinking about being a scientist or a business person or something else?
Well, I actually was interested in two things. One, in being involved in politics as a politician, but also in working on peace and working on peace at the international level. And I've tried as best I could over the years to do a little bit of both, and I've continued to do that. And it's an honor and a privilege to be working with like-minded people in this field and trying to really basically put into practice what I've been always hoping to be involved with. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yes, and welcome Mercy from Rwanda. Please keep letting us know where you're watching from and your questions and comments. So can you describe a little bit, from Lebanon, did you pursue undergraduate degree? Did you start in Lebanon? Did you go to Paris, the US? And kind of when you started to explore your professional career, how did you decide which universities to go to and which fields to study? And what were the most valuable skills you developed, let's say, through your undergraduate and master's degree?
Sure. Well, obviously, I grew up, as I said earlier, in times of war. At the time when I started my university studies, another episode of the war, the long war, which started as a regional war, then turned into a civil war in the country, led me to basically leave the country because my university got destroyed. I ended up in Paris at the American University in Paris, studying international economics and minoring in political science while working full-time at a school there. And then from there to Johns Hopkins in Italy for a year, and then in Washington, D.C. for a year. And then after that, began working in Washington, D.C., and then joined the PhD program there. The interesting part, I guess, in all of this is that, we're driven by two things, really. One is, availability of programs that match our interests, but also the resources that are needed in order to do that. And so sometimes resources force us in one direction or another, obviously living conditions to start with, but then, assuming you're living in a country where there's no conflict, it's mostly your interest versus your ability to afford that education. Now, I realize for many who are in Europe or in other places where education might be more accessible or less expensive, that may not be as big of a problem. But obviously, in American type style education institutions, financial consideration are a considerable part of also the choices that one makes. And so, working or finding scholarships or getting other means of support is an essential part of how we move forward. And then to add, perhaps, on the skills, that one has to, I guess resilience and grit and the ability to stay focused on one's goals is really essential. You'll hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, what do you really want to do that? Can you really do that?" And I always felt that determination was a key factor in being able to get where I wanted to get, despite all the challenges that I was facing, not being able to rely on any support from the family at many points in time, having to keep a job while going to school, etc.
So thank you so much. And we have lots of people from East and West Africa. So we'll see if we get anybody from the MENA region. So welcome Philip back. Welcome Olugana. So Philip from Kenya and Olugana from Nigeria. And we have Rwanda. So if you think about your early, let's say, professional career, as you were finishing your master's, what are your tips for people? Because you've been working in the space of democratization, governance, civil society, peace building. So what are your tips? I mean, now you're pretty senior level. I'm not calling you old, I'm saying you're experienced. But what are your tips for how in the world, particularly, let's say, if you're an international student to begin with, how to find jobs, and think back to 20, 25 years ago, where the jobs were, and, how are things changed for people seeking to work in that sector these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I guess I guess a lot of a lot of what is needed is for individuals to really research their field and contact people who are in this field. So I think this podcast, for example, is a helpful way for people to learn about how to go about things, and because they're interacting or listening to people who have actually gone through this experience and who've had to really ask the questions and talk to the people who could give them, the ropes and how to get to where they want to be. Obviously, for someone who's starting and whose parents perhaps were not, studying internationally or working internationally, that might be more complicated because you may not have the right contacts, you may not have the right experience back home to hear your parents talk about, or your siblings or others. But I feel that ultimately what it boils down to is educating oneself on the options that are out there, and doing that through reading, but also doing that through learning from others, and obviously talking to others and interacting with others, and then looking at the options that are there in order to be able to move forward. Internships are a wonderful place to start for many graduates who, once they leave, university, are often looking for jobs and maybe may not be able to find a job on a full-time basis right away for a number of reasons. Some having to do with visa restrictions, some having to do with other things. And I've always been a big proponent of having or starting with internships and acquiring experience that way, and making contacts and learning about the field that you're interested in order to also build one's resume and then move to the next stage.
Wonderful. Welcome Hana from Amman. Welcome Yuvrai from Nepal. Danjuma from Nigeria. Please keep letting us know where you're watching from and your questions. So Makram, I did a lot of democratization studies. I lived in Hungary right after the end of the Cold War. We read a lot of the second, third wave of democratization studies. And if you think back to when you started in your career to now, what would you just say about the state of, whether you want to call it governance studies, democratization? So like, what have we actually learned that works well, in terms of helping, whether it's people in their own country or region, or let's say others trying to influence? Like, what is the state of democratization studies, since we're having a huge backslide? Like I remember the early 90s, and it was like the idea, when the Berlin Wall came down, I moved to Hungary about 8 months afterwards, and we're like, this is going to be the peace dividend and the age of democratization. And not that we were going to be happy forever, but like there was a lot of optimism, and then it's like, where are we today? And, what is the state of whatever you want to call the intersection, the field you're working in?
Well, it's a big question, and it's a complex question, because obviously we're yet to find a better political system than democracy. But at the same time, we are seeing also the limits of democratic systems when they are confronted with economic downturns, when they're confronted with scarcity, when they're confronted with regional conflict, when they're confronted with internal divisions that have, I guess, are difficult to solve, and where institutions may not be fine-tuned enough to be able to offer solutions. And that is also a place where we have to learn from each other. But fundamentally, I feel that the space and freedom is at the heart of any of our ability to pursue and to perfect our institutions. And so I guess the most and the quintessential value here is the ability to listen to others, to learn from others, to engage with others, and to build with others. And all of that cannot be done if there isn't freedom to talk, freedom to listen, freedom to respect, freedom to be with the others. And I know this sounds like very basic, but unfortunately we're seeing in a lot of countries attempts by institutions, by governments, to really rein in either a certain group or certain tendencies or certain perspectives. And unfortunately, that's a dangerous trend, in my opinion. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Welcome, Danjuma from International Alert, which is one of the best peace-building organizations working on policy, practice, and impact. Welcome, Innocent from Malawi. So if you think about across your career, can you share what you feel comfortable with, whether it's policy practice, whether it's working in Lebanon or Iraq or Nigeria? What are some examples of, let's say, projects or partnerships or research that you feel like you've helped to advance some significant impact or learning in the field of governance, civil society, or democratization? Not saying you've magically solved something, but some of the projects that you feel more proud of.
Well, I guess that I'll boil it down to coalition building. And the reason why is because I spend a lot of my time working with different groups to build coalition around specific issues. And I've come to the conclusion and to the conviction, I guess, that, in many contexts, working alone is a difficult proposition. And it's also a proposition that requires you to be able to connect with others and able to have an impact. And I feel that coalition building is an area that needs to be given more attention. We see that in negotiations at the national level, with unions, with other institutions. We see that between political parties. We see that, with civil society advocating for different things. And so I feel that, this is the area where I've personally been able to contribute the most, and where I feel that we need to perfect the kinds of tools that we have to build coalitions and to build them effectively and to build them in order to have impact.
And any examples from your own work or partners' work where,
yes,
whether it's Lebanon or another country or region, where there's been, can you provide an example of kind of the type of coalition, and then what have been some of the challenges or where they've advocated for change? Has been policy change or just collaboration around funding, or some examples of how you've made that concrete?
Sure, I'm happy to. But the efforts that I've been involved with have had two focuses, if you'd like, over the years. The first has had to do with civil peace, growing, being in a country that has been going through a lot of internal turmoil and a lot of internal divisions, working to build cross-confessional, cross-sectarian, cross-regional, or within the country, obviously, groups and coalitions, is really essential to really being able to push back against, more divisive, more sectarian, more conflictual kind of narratives, if you'd like. Another area that I've been quite involved in, and I'll comment on both, has been to work with groups that have been more reform-minded, to try and push for political reform in specific area, to enhance good governance, to push against corruption, to push against, or to increase transparency, to maintain a certain space for freedom of expression, for political freedom, etc. And in both these cases, there are a lot of lessons that one can point to, and I'm happy to discuss those if you'd like, Craig.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to hear whether it's a current or past example, where, whether it's on an SDG, peace education, governance, taxation, something either that you've researched or helped facilitate or been a member coalition of.
Sure. I played a leading role with a big coalition of over 32 groups on working on civil peace. And it was really very interesting to see this process unfold, and to see where we began with a lot of mutual lack of trust and fear and obviously dealing with the past, a past that is still being dealt with today in Lebanon, like I know in many other countries that have experienced conflict, and then realizing that you could find common ground across sectors. And here's the interesting part, is that you're not only building between people who are interested in a specific outcome, let's say, or a specific goal, but you're also working with people who suddenly discover that what brings them together is much bigger and much more important than what separates them. And that process is a learning process. And then suddenly you see these same individuals who are often fighting against each other, who are often on opposite sides of the political spectrum, suddenly finding tremendous opportunities to work together and to collaborate, and a willingness to do that. And not only that, a willingness to go then and try to influence other people in doing the same. And that, I think, is really special and very, very unique. Not unique to this country, but unique in the sense that you can really make a contribution in that regard.
So we have a question from Yuvrai, who's a Rotary Peace Fellow. So just in full transparency, the Rotary Peace Fellows program does advertise with PCDN. The application's open February 1st. It's one of the best fellowships in the world. I've taught in the program many times. So Yuvrai is saying he was in Lebanon shortly after the 2006 war, and he saw the situation as somewhat similar, 2021 versus 17 years. So where do you see the problem in peace education? So he's talking about Lebanon specifically, but in general, like peace education, he's saying might be too hippie-ish or too idealistic. So, and you actually might talk a little bit about your dissertation research. So, a lot of people, when they're talking about complex conflicts, say we just need to do education and teach peace in the schools and build cross-cutting ties. And hopefully that will lead to a more stable society. So what is your view as an expert in peace education, whether specific to Lebanon or elsewhere? What do we know that works, and where are the challenges or limitations?
Sure. Thank you, Yuvrak, for your question and your interesting question. I guess I would make a few distinctions here. The first has to do with international conflict versus national conflict. Obviously, in international conflict, the actors, you are often forced to deal with the actors through international forums. And these international forums have their rules and regulations, have their way of I guess, enforcing certain decisions or not. And so the 2006 war was one that involved that involved Israel and Lebanon, but I'm talking more about coalition building to promote civil peace within the same country. And here in this case in Lebanon, noting that many groups in this country were in conflict for decades, or for years, and then we were working on trying to push beyond that. Now, obviously, external conditions and even internal conditions can influence or can push you backward, no doubt. But there are lessons learned in the field of peace and conflict resolution that can really help you move a certain society forward, or at least identify ways to do that, and also look at mechanisms that have been tested elsewhere. When it comes to international conflict, on the other hand, I think that your question is a good one. We see a lot of backsliding in this arena. We also see, not that we don't see it at national level in certain countries, we do, and I don't want to dismiss that either. But all I'm trying to say here is that it is a more complicated game when it comes to international conflicts than when it comes to national conflicts. At least at the national level, if you are an actor and you're working hard from within, at least you have the ability to reach all sides and bring all sides together, which is a much more complicated proposition when you're talking about international conflict, and especially when there are other actors that can influence both sides of the aisle.
Thank you so much, Brian. Please, people, do check out the Rotary Peace Fellowship. So a follow-up question. Lebanon obviously has seen severe economic challenges the past few years, since the horrible bomb blast, or not the bomb blast, but the blast at the port.
Yes.
And doesn't have a president, as far as I know. Like, there's a lot of political instability. So, and Lebanon did experience, let's say, a pretty good degree of stability, in the 90s and 2000s. So, what do you think we could learn from both the more stable times in Lebanon, and how much of the current challenges are due to economic insecurity, regional powers, like what would you say, like if people want to understand Lebanon some, like both the positive lessons about, yes, it's possible to recover from a civil war and have a very dynamic, healthy society, and what are some of the cautions?
Well, I'll start with the cautions, to be very frank. Um, it's clear that small countries and small countries that have experienced a war that became a civil war are very can be easily influenced, especially when many of the factions that live within the country have linkages back to other parts of the region or the world. These linkages are a source of instability. Add to that any lack of progress on the governance front or on certain areas, and you end up with a situation where the internal ability of a country to push back against foreign interference or regional problems to be quite difficult, and that is at the heart of the first lesson, which is that any country has to try as best it can find a way of shielding itself from external interference. Now, it isn't possible to live in a bubble because you are living in a very dynamic environment with a lot of regional powers, but you have to be able to find some minimum internal consensus that would enable you to shield yourself from external interference. More easily said than done, obviously, especially in a country like Lebanon, which is coming out of a conflict and still has some groups tied to the outside. But it's something that's really essential. And that's lesson number one, I guess. Lesson number two is that you have to work on the internal fabric of the society in order to build that consensus. And that consensus is not something that you can get with the push of a button. You have to cultivate it. You have to work on it. You have to go to the schools. You have to work on the young generation. And you also have to demystify certain, myths of, war as the only way of solving problems internally, or and war as being the way that certain groups assert themselves on other groups. And when you see countries around the world that are teetering on the edge, we really have a joint responsibility to say, no, we've tried this, it doesn't work. Go to the table, negotiate, find better ways, be driven by facts, be magnanimous in certain areas. We have to do that. And that's where, peacemakers and people who believe in conflict resolution have to really be active and support each other and be a community, really, because that's what it takes. And when we see something that's not right, we have to all together raise our voices, and we have to say that together. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Nedra from Salt Lake City. And Hannah, thanks for sharing. She's just commenting. She works with UNRWA and really identifies what you're saying, and they work with Palestinian refugees in Jordan. And obviously, please keep the questions and comments coming. So Makram, you've worked across many different sectors. And so one thing, for going back to some career questions, you have a PhD in conflict resolution. When people come to you, whether it's from Lebanon or the US or any country in the world, and they say, like, peace building, it's just a pipe dream. Like, people are naturally aggressive, and whoever has the most power and weapons is going to decide the world order. Do you have any data about peace building or any arguments, when someone's like, it's like negotiations don't work. It's like, he who has the most toys wins. So what is the data you go, or, what kind of responses you give to people? Because right now, obviously, we're in a phase in the world, again, where there's a lot of military conflict and escalation of violence. So, what kind of data do you provide as a peace builder that, like maybe either war isn't always effective, or there is evidence to show peace building under certain conditions can lead to strong outcomes?
Well, there are a few things that we should keep in mind at all times. Is that after humans destroy each other, they most of the time have to go back to negotiation and to peacemaking in order to be able to move forward. The history of Europe after World War I and World War II is the perfect example of that. Civil wars in many countries around the world, including the United States and elsewhere, is another example of that, including in this country. So the question then becomes, how do we best manage these conflicts to reduce casualties and to make sure that we are able to reach something that's better than what we've come from? And then the second is, how do we put in mechanisms so that we stop from stumbling into new conflicts? And what are the structures and mechanisms that are needed in order to do that? And for many people, that's not obvious, and it's not the way they think. Starting with how we raise our kids, and how we instruct them to deal with conflict at the school, in the schoolyard, or at school, all the way to how we deal with neighboring countries, or how do we deal with internal dynamics of conflict in our societies. So it's not something that we are born with. We're born with more instinctive reactions, and I think we all need to develop those skills, and we need to develop those techniques, and we need to learn them. And I feel that it's interesting that our first PhD, the first PhD program in the United States was in 1989. But conflicts have been raging for thousands of years, and we've only applied discipline to studying this field for the past couple of 2 or 3 decades. And so I think we have a long way to go, but we're starting somewhere, and I think that's a good thing.
Okay. So a follow-up question. So when people come to you, and let's say they're in their 20s, and whether they're from Lebanon or Jordan or Israel or Palestine or the US, and they're like, I want to pursue a career making a difference in the world. And let's say they have some interest in governance or civil society or peace. What is your advice for, let's say, younger professionals or aspiring professionals? Should they consider grad school? Should they try to work for an INGO, a think tank? Like, for people who are like, they want to do impact, but they're not sure where to find the right path for themselves. Any general advice, how to determine what's the right steps or the skills, or where to find paid employment?
Well, I would say first, and not related to that, but directly related to that, grab onto your values and to your human values, because that is the way that you'll be able to withstand and resist the surroundings that you are experiencing, whether it's a shooting in a school, whether it's a conflict in your neighborhood, whether it is about a country trying to force or impose on another country a certain given. So that's the first thing, and I think that would be the first piece of advice. Moving from there, I would say try to build on what you're best at, and try to build by looking at organizations that connect what you're best at with what you're interested in doing. So if, let's say, you're an artist and you're interested in helping kids deal with trauma, or deal with conflict, or deal with their rage problems, connect yourself with organizations that create that link. Same thing with human rights. Same thing with political science and willingness to interest in good governance. And then I would argue that after that, look for academic programs that tie that experience and that knowledge, so that you can further deepen your knowledge, but also give yourself an opportunity to think and to reflect on other people's experiences, so that then you can take that and push that forward. And obviously, if you are interested in further academic inquiry and research, then obviously going for a PhD that matches that interest is an essential part of that long life journey. I mean, a PhD is only a first step towards that, but it's an important step, and I think it's something that people should consider seriously.
Okay, thank you. So Hannah's just making a comment from Jordan. The awareness is so critical, and neutrality is becoming challenging. And obviously, I think a lot of people, including myself, would say, I mean, it's interesting. This is going back 30 years ago. I had a human rights person say to me, I don't like you peace builders because you're wishy-washy and sometimes there's clear rights and wrong. And I think there are different perspectives on what's going on in Israel and Palestine, but I think, or Gaza, but I think most people would say, but the attack, Hamas's attack was horrific. And, the Israeli collective punishment is horrific, and neither one is going to advance security. So a question to follow up. So two questions. So one is, you've worked both at the centers of power and you've also worked, let's say, in more regional places. And there's been a lot of talk in development and governance about localization. The idea is that, expats, whether they're from the global north or from regional neighboring countries, parachuting in, even if it's for a couple of years, to help fix or address or build more stable institutions. That's not the solution. What it is they're really local capacity, local knowledge, and people who are there for the long term is what's going to create stability. So have you seen changes in both the funding dynamics and the practices where it's less coming out of the capitals where the money's flowing from to actually like supporting local innovation and learning? Or, your thoughts, because both, working in Lebanon for almost 20 years, both in academia and policy, like, have you seen a change in kind of whose expertise is valued and also where the funding goes?
It's a broad question because it touches many fields and many areas. I would argue that yes, there has been progress. There has been an emphasis on sort of more local skill development and more localized sort of capacity building, and that's a positive trend. There's also been more initiatives at the regional level and not necessarily at international level, which have also been of value. I think that some of the problems that we encounter on a daily basis is figuring out how to build the capacity of sustaining these efforts at the local level, sustaining these efforts at the regional level because of cost, because of other considerations, but also how to counter, if you would like, foreign policy decisions made by influential actors that may go against progress made at the local level, progress made at the regional level. And that is often where we really feel that there's a inconsistency and sometimes a frustrating effort at reversing progress made at both the local or at regional levels. And that, to me, is really something that we really need to work on, because there's still almost no accountability somehow in that realm. And you feel sometimes very vulnerable. And unfortunately, our international structure still does not have the built-in mechanism to, deal with excesses of foreign policy when they are clearly, imposing themselves on the fate of innocent people, or on, the economic livelihood of certain groups, or on the extraction of resources in certain countries. So all of that together is really an important area that we really need to hone in more effort and skills, and I hope that the next phase, the next generation of peace builders will apply more gray matter to these issues as well.
So a follow-up question we ask a lot of our guests, and maybe your own reflections and recommendations for others. So some people would say it's better to go into the system, whatever the system means, whether it's governments or private sector NGOs, and try to affect policy and change from within. Others would say the system, whatever that means to them, like that if you're going to go in, more often you're going to become part of the system than change it. And some people would say it's better to be out and hold them accountable, and then other people would say, well, it's not about accountability. It's like, we need radical change. And it's, there's in the system, there's accountability, and there's like advocating radical change. And I'm not asking you to take a perspective, but when people are thinking about their careers, any thoughts about how you would advise people to make that decision? Like whether to join, whether it's the EU or the Arab League or, the UN, versus like be at a third party, ING or somebody else holding them accountable versus advocating change?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, for at a personal level, it has been an issue of a moral compass. Where's my moral compass, and how does that match, what I'm seeing and what I'm getting myself into? So that's, I think, at the personal level. At a sort of more theoretical level, I guess, I would say we need both. We need people who are working from within, and we need people from outside who are willing to stand up and who are willing to push and who are willing to advocate, who are willing to raise their voices. So we need both. We can't work with one and not the other. And to be very frank, there are many times when working within makes a bigger difference, and there are times when working from outside makes a bigger difference. So you have to really have the right. You have to judge these case by case, but you also have to see also from your own moral standpoint, is going into this kind of a job compromise your values, or compromise your judgment on what ultimately you'll be involved in. And that's not an easy question, because sometimes there are other imperatives like livelihood and survival. But I think it's an essential question that one has to ask him or herself at all times, even when you're within the same job for a while and some conditions change that force you to make a reassessment.
Thank you so much. I'll make one comment, then a few questions have come in. So one, everybody needs to pay the bills. I mean, unless somehow you have independent source of funding or wealth.
Sure.
And there definitely have been times, I wouldn't say I've been part of efforts that have done harm, but I've been part of, let's say, projects where it's like someone in a certain setting, I won't get into specifics, but let's say a politician has an idea, let's do this. And this sounds really good, like let's help make peace in X country. And that has to translate into a program that needs to get funded. And often that vision of like, let's do something where funding is allocated and some organization gets funding to implement, like there's a lot of bizarre practices that can happen along that chain. So it's good intentions, and I'm not saying it's a bad program, but I've seen a lot, including things I've been part of, where like it's the allocation of resources and projects, because a lot of it takes place in a broader system of business of change. Like there's just I've seen some bizarre things, but let's get to some questions. So Nedra from US do you have a small step you can recommend to help, let's say, move peace forward now for conflict practitioners in the US? So any reflections around key institutions or organizations, because obviously when I was younger, I think I was more naive, thinking not that the US had all the solutions, but like we could share a lot with the world. And the more I've lived overseas, like everybody has we're all messed up. And if we had more humility and just learned the good and the bad from all other countries, we'd be better off. So any recommendations for US practitioners?
Sure. Nedra, thank you for this wonderful question. I guess, having a foot in two worlds, and having grown up in a country that experienced internal strife, I've learned one very important lesson. Do not always agree with the people who are in your camp, because if you do, you forget that the other camp has people who are willing and able to, show compassion and willingness to work with you. And unfortunately, that's the most difficult thing, especially when the country is very polarized. But we have to continue to believe that there's someone on the other side that also is looking for a different way of moving forward. And falling into the trap of everyone who's on the other side is the devil is really counterproductive. And I know it's hard, and I know it's hard, and I'm not saying it's not difficult, but I really believe that you can bring people together from all sides if you have a well-defined mission, well-defined sort of goal, and also are willing to withstand the pressures and the if you'd like the efforts of many to say, we don't want that middle ground. We don't want to see people who are willing to, go across that aisle and reach out to the other side and try to find common ground. I don't know if that helps, but that's my advice.
Thank you so much. So Hannah has a question. It's a big one. Do you think there's a standard moral compass for policymakers? That's very big, so you can interpret that. Thanks, Hannah, for the question.
My belief is that there is a standard, but unfortunately, many don't abide by it, or at least, many decide to ignore it when their own either narrow personal interest or their national interest dictated by certain policies force them to go by. I mean, we see the resignation of certain noble individuals when they see things that no longer match their moral stands, and I feel that you really, if you would like, you have to be willing to abide by certain principles. And I feel that many of the international charters that people have reached together and have now established as, if you'd like, standards for humans across the globe, irrespective of their background, their religion, etc., are a pretty good start. Where one can also turn inwards, when in doubt, but I think that's a pretty good start.
So going back to more career questions, so can you reflect, since you've worked both in policy, let's say INGOs around democratization, and then academia, just what are the pros and cons, if you had to say, if you're thinking about a career, or at least your next job, because career is a big thing, but what's your next job? Like the pros and cons of working, let's say, in the donor or the governance implementation sector versus, you're running one of the leading think tanks versus being a professor. Just like what is amazing about, I'm not saying the specific organization, but the type of employer, and what are some of the challenges, that's just so people are aware of those things.
Well, I mean, it's quite different depending on the organization that you're working with. But I guess, are you asking specifically as a think tank, or are you asking as in general in terms of this field or this area?
No, I'm asking, like, so if someone wants to work more in, let's say, policy implementation, like here's the pros and here's some, not specific to an institution, but that type of employer versus, they want to be part of a think tank versus like, and the versus like, maybe be a researcher and academic.
Well, it depends on a number of things, I feel. One, it depends on how hands-on you want to be versus how sort of theoretical you want to be. So it will depends also on how independent you want to be and how committed to one side or one area or one group you want to be. That is also an important element, I guess, of how you position yourself in the job market, because obviously the same goals are being discussed and are being worked for in different ways from different perspectives, and you have to decide. You want to be a non-partisan actor, you want to be a partisan actor, you want to be focused mostly on research. You are interested in being in politics and acting, or in civil society and acting on specific problems. Positioning oneself, I guess, is the key here, both in terms of the type of work you want to do, but also the vantage point from which you want to approach that job or that work. I hope that helps.
And then for people who want, since you're currently leading one of the top think tanks in the region, for people, let's say, not everyone's going to run a think tank, but let's say if they're going to work as a researcher or admin or policy, like what is amazing about being part of a policy think tank, and what are some things you would say, because at least in DC, or Geneva or London, there's a lot of think tanks like Brookings and Carnegie, and lots of young professionals want to work for them. So obviously there's lots of different roles in a policy think tank, but what are some of the wondrous things like you either get to do as a leader or your staff gets to do, and what are some of the challenges?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we have a vantage point that few other people know, and that's because we're doing evidence-based or driven research. The second is that we get to hear the perspective of different people, and across the political spectrum and across socioeconomic groups. And that's a very interesting starting point, let's say. And the next is that you're able to maybe test certain things. You may be able to develop ideas and grow these ideas. You can also encourage individual to see things maybe in a different way, encourage them to adopt certain policies that might be of help. And then when you see that some of these recommendations end up in a law, and end up in a decision or circular or whatever, that a government body or government institution is adopting, then you obviously feel that what you've done has had an impact. You also have a role to play in the national discourse or the regional discourse, obviously, or international discourse for that matter, when it comes to certain issues and topics. We're currently working, for example, on issues pertaining to renewable energy across multiple countries. And I'm sure that this work with others is going to have an impact, and will hopefully be opening the eyes of different people on how renewable energy can be used by small and medium enterprises, how it can involve a larger number of young people, how it can involve different genders, etc. So it's these kinds of opportunities that we have that I think are really unique and special and exciting, because they ultimately have an impact down the line. Now, obviously, many people who come to think tanks often end up going after that to specialize in a certain area or to be involved in politics, or they come from politics to work in think tanks and then go back to politics because they need a time to write, they need a time to think, they need a time to. So yeah, I think that is, I think, the most unique thing that we do.
Okay. And when you think about across your roles, whether at the Lebanese American University or your current role or NDI, when you've helped to hire people, so any thoughts for, one is any metrics, is like, let's say if you've had any job openings the past few years, how many applications you've gotten, or just a range. And then what makes the difference between taking a second look at an application to potentially interviewing? Like what makes someone stand out, and your recommendations for job seekers as they're applying for roles?
Well, obviously, we receive hundreds of resumes for different positions, so it depends on the position, obviously, and it depends on the scope of the position. But I guess what stands out the most is the right fit to start with, to be selected, to be, at least kept as part of the pool of people who will be interviewed. The next thing is, and obviously we have panels usually who interview, not just one person. Uh, the next thing, I guess, would be the interpersonal skills that people have, and their ability to communicate in an articulate way, what they've done, how it's relevant to where they're coming, to the position they're applying for, their ability to highlight perhaps experiences and skills that they have that are a good match with the position. So knowing and understanding the position one is applying for, and knowing how to speak to the needs of the organization when it comes to these skills, and when it comes to the organization's needs, I think is essential. And that starts with doing that at the level of the application and the cover letter that you write. And I think that one piece of advice that's very important is, don't just write a cover letter that's generic and that seems to be to apply to any job, because it will most of the time be rejected at the get-go. And so give attention to what the organization wants, and also try to be objective about your capabilities when it comes to matching the skills that are required. So if you see that there are a number of skills that you don't have, just don't bother. go for another job. You'd be better suited for a different job. And that is unfortunately advice that not many people want to hear or don't hear. And I feel is unfortunate because they end up wasting a lot of time and energy at a time when they could be investing a little bit more attention in other application that would give them a much better yield in terms of potential interviews and ultimately a job.
Okay. Thank you so much. Someone said they lost sound for a second. So if this was interrupted, it can happen. The podcast will be out within a week or two, so you can listen to the full episode then as well. So last two questions. When you're not busy parenting or advocating or researching or running a think tank, what do you do? Are you any favorite books you're watching, any series, or just something like we always ask people, like not work related, just something that you would recommend others might take a look at, podcast, book, TV series, or movie?
Well, I am interested in biographies, so I read the biographies of different people, but I'm interested in personal development books. I'm always looking for a recommendation, looking for advice on how to develop my personal skills. And another area is to really find, I guess, times with people to discuss issues that would be, you'd have a hard time finding time to discuss. And these times and these slots of special moments with individuals where you can develop your ideas and exchange are, to me, very special, and I encourage people to do that.
Okay, and then the last question, on think tanks, if people are interested in think tanks, is a great resource for, they have a winter or summer school and a job board. But in general, what communities do you go to, conferences or websites or associations, whether it's think tank related or not? But for people who are interested in governance and policy and think tanks, like where do you suggest conferences, listservs, websites, and any other favorite ones besides on think tanks?
Well, yes, there are a number of organizations that work at the international level to start with on issues of governance. I think that many career offices keep a long list of these organizations. Some UN organizations also keep a roster of organizations that work in specific countries on specific issues. PCDN is one very good source of such information. We have we in different countries, obviously different institutions may have also a list of organizations that work in specific areas. But in general, I would recommend university career offices. There are also certain publications that come out. I know in certain countries, that's not everywhere, unfortunately. And then finally, obviously, conferences, specialized conferences bring together usually a lot of experts. And I would definitely encourage people to attend those in their country, especially young people who aspire to be part of these fields, because these conferences or these talks are an opportunity to meet people, but also to network and to build across a wide network of people that can ultimately get you entry into the field that you're interested in.
Okay, greetings, Kimberly. And then the last question, so for people who want to stay informed about your work or the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, what's the best channel? Do you have, is LinkedIn, X or Twitter, or you get on your listserv? So just for people, both you as a professional and the center, what are the best channels?
Well, we have an account on X. We have one on Instagram. We have one on Facebook, and our website is an excellent resource of, and almost all our publications are in both English and Arabic. So if you're interested in looking at different areas, the main areas which are good governance, sustainable economic development, issues pertaining to vulnerable population, and finally environment, I highly encourage you to visit our website. we could, or to visit our center, Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. So, yeah.
And then what about you as a professional? Like, do you have a channel? I mean, obviously you're connected to the center, but are you active on any of the channels sharing other things?
I'm actually not that active in that regard, but I'm very interested in replying and engaging with media representatives and individuals who are interested in exchanging. So I'd be happy to share my email address, and if anyone is interested in us having a side discussion about anything they're interested in pertaining to the topic of this podcast, I'd be more than happy to.
Okay, so thank you so much for sharing generously your wisdom, your experience, your insights, and when the power went off, it's the reality in a lot of places. And please, everyone, check out the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, follow Makram, check out PCDN, share the podcast when it comes out, which will be either this Friday or the following Friday. Stay tuned for lots more episodes. We hope things in Lebanon stay relatively peaceful. It's obviously a crazy time in a lot of the world, and especially right now in your region. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We had a lot of people from Africa. And thank you for your questions and your comments, and stay tuned for future episodes.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you for all the listeners as well.